Now, let's take a closer look at a bigger story this week. As many of you know, if you watch the rundown religiously, which of course you do, I was absent last week because I was in London attending Commvault SHIFT. And this was a major industry presentation. This is their second SHIFT event. I shared some information from that event, and as did a lot of other folks in our community on our Gestalt IT live blog, as well as on, I wrote an article on LinkedIn, for example, as did some of the others. But overall, what we saw was Commvault moving forward with their plan to transform the company into a cyber resilience company and, as the CEO said, into a company focused on continuous business rather than business continuity, which is a cute turn of phrase. Sure, I'll give you that. But the point is that, to me, the overarching point of this whole event that really spoke volumes was Commvault is very keen on addressing the needs of their company, of their customers, rather than focusing on what their technology can do, which is a very refreshing thing in the tech industry, because most in the tech industry, especially in the data protection industry, have basically been focused for the last probably 30, 40 years on, isn't it cool that we can dump data to tape and find it and bring it back again, instead of, what problem are we trying to solve here? Is this about data governance? Is this about archiving for litigation? Is this about preparing ourselves in the event of a cyber attack? And how does this work in this modern cloud first era? Because again, Commvault has been in business so long that you would think that they wouldn't be clued in to how modern applications are built. But quite to the contrary, almost all of the technical presentations at Shift were focused on modern cloud first applications, and indeed even SaaS applications. And the company has recently made acquisitions of Appranix and Clumio that are specifically geared toward supporting those type of modern cloud first applications. Alan, I know that you know quite a lot about this industry overall, the cyber security industry. What is your take on data protection companies and their messaging in getting into cybersecurity?
So I like the word resilience, right? And first of all, I know Sanjay, the CEO at Commvault for many years. Sanjay at one time was the CEO at Puppet. I don't know if you knew that. And before that, he was in Singapore for many years, telecom executive. He's incredibly bright, sharp guy, and he's built a heck of a team at Commvault over the years. I interviewed Sanjay when he first moved over to Commvault. This word resiliency is a great word because it encompasses so much about what's going on in cyber today, in that we're never going to stop attacks from taking place. I think we put a lot of effort into it. We do our best, but realistically speaking, we can't put all our eggs in the prevention basket. We need to put a good, healthy bet in our response and recovery basket. And resiliency embodies that, right? And yes, there were people who used to get off watching those robotic arms take the tapes out. If you ever been to data centers where they have that, well, you have in your background, Stephen, and that was cool looking. But in the heat of the moment, stuff hits the fan, and you're saying, "I need to restore from that." From this date, and you're watching that arm move ever so slowly, 1 degree at a time, and pulling out. And now, how long does it take to restore from that? It was like watching paint dry, and it wasn't. I was so disappointed when we at one time had to do that. But that being said, this resiliency thing uh, a great title to latch onto for Commvault to really modernize. I mean, quite frankly, they never had a cloud story, right? We're 20 years in the cloud, or the cloud era, let's call it. Don't
Yeah,
you think
it is
it's about
interesting
time?
that it took the arrival of somebody, a completely different kind of executive team to really change the game for Commvault. As
Mhm.
noted, I mean, we had our own Daniel Newman and Patrick Moorhead sit down with Sanjay Mirchandani, and I think that's what you just said is really the message that comes through loud and clear in that conversation.
It really is. But that being said, you know what they say, better late than never. And they're here. and they bring substantial assets to it. I mean, they are, I don't want to use the term disaster recovery or backup like that, but they're a force to be reckoned with in that market. And if they can, you know, complete this pivot, and they're doing it, you mentioned some acquisitions. We're going to talk about one of them in a little bit. Um, this is a doable thing, and I think they have a great line, if you will, right? Their vision here, I think, is spot on. So, as I say, better late than never. Good for them. Now, execution's another story, and it's a crowded market. The last time I checked, there's something like 7,000 venture-backed or public companies in the cyberspace. So it's a crowded market with everyone saying, "Look at me, look at me, look at me." Um, but Commvault has the assets and resources to make people look at them.
Well, there's a few less venture-backed companies in the cyberspace thanks to Commvault. As you mentioned, they bought a couple of companies. It was very nice to see Clumio on stage. We talked about them on the September 25th episode of the Rundown. And this acquisition was really too soon, too new to make much of an impact on the content at Shift, though it was nice to see some familiar faces on stage uh, talking about what they're doing with their really strong expertise around AWS S3 and doing snapshots and consistent data sets from S3 history. But I think the biggest focus was really on the Appranix acquisition, which is enabling their cloud rewind, which is a way to literally rewind or recreate a cloud application to the state that it was in at a point in the past. Now, this could be very valuable for things like compliance reasons, where we need to see where the data was and what was going on at a certain point in the past. Also, of course, this could be huge if you're getting hit by hackers or ransomware or something like that on your cloud applications. One of the things that was mentioned on stage, and I really want to emphasize this, a lot of companies assume that their SaaS providers are doing data protection on their behalf. Yeah, that ain't happening. That really ain't happening. And so, if you're relying on this stuff for your business, it really is a good idea to try to have some kind of data protection, some kind of backup, so that you can get to a known good state. But that's not super easy to do, especially when you have infrastructure as code, which potentially is redoing your entire infrastructure configuration all the time. How do you do that? Well, that's what Appranix was working on, and that's why Commvault has this. Are you familiar with these solutions, Ann?
Yeah, very much so. And Stephen, to reiterate or reinforce what you said, it's one thing to do this kind of thing when it's in an on-premises data center and you literally control the hardware, you control the storage, you control that data like that, on the hardware. When you're in the cloud and you're dealing in an S3, you know, environment, you don't have, root access, if you will. Restoring an application to a state on a given point of time is not the easiest thing in the world. I mean, because the whole point of when you go to the cloud, you're entering into a partnership with your cloud provider. But they're big, they're hyperscale, and they don't always give you all the attention you may want, or they charge you an arm and a leg for it. And so doing this kind of restore in the cloud live like that, it's impressive. That's an impressive feat.
In, in fact, in fact, those of us who've been in the industry for a long time, even more static on-prem infrastructure can sometimes be hard to recreate. People aren't documenting all the time when they add a new front-end server or when they add a new connector to some other application. That's the cool thing about the Cloud Rewind solution, is that it's basically I don't know, disaster recovery as code, in that it's actually going in there and looking at the code that defines the infrastructure and making sure that all that is picked up on a continuous basis. I love it.
Absolutely. And also for compliance, I think you mentioned it briefly, but I want to emphasize from a compliance point of view, what a great thing to have. What a great thing to have.
Absolutely. And yeah, to be able to confidently say, yes, this is the state that our application infrastructure was in. This is how we can make it run again. Yeah, and so I really feel at this point that there's sort of a four-horse race here in data protection. We have soon to be, well, we have number one currently, Veeam, soon to be number one in terms of sales volume, Cohesitas, or is it Vericity? Yeah, so Cohesity and Veritas, and then of course Commvault and Rubrik. And all of these companies are really making quite a lot of this. Now, of course, there are a lot of other data protection companies out there. I don't want to give short shrift to them. But according to most analyst reports, those are the top four. And those are the ones that are really duking it out at the top of this industry. It's interesting that each of them is taking a slightly different approach as well. So, you know how Veeam has traditionally come for the mass market, the smaller businesses, whereas Commvault has always been more targeted, and Veritas have always been more targeted at the higher end, larger companies. I think that that's one way to look at it. And then you've got companies like Rubrik and Cohesity that have, they're really focused on data protection to their own disk or not disk storage platforms. Though, of course, again, that's been changed a lot. I think a lot of the things that we assumed about these companies, though, are kind of out the window. I hear from my friends in Asia that Veeam is very active in some of the largest enterprise accounts. I hear from my friends in the cloud that companies like Cohesity are absolutely able to deliver things that aren't what you would think of as Cohesity data protection. And I hear from modern applications and so on that they're very impressed by what Commvault is doing. Which again, I never thought I would be saying, but I absolutely am saying that because that's the state of the industry now. And so it's going to be, we'll be watching on the rundown, we'll be watching on TechStrong how this all plays out now that the industry is changing so much.
I'll tell you something else to keep an eye on, Stephen, and that is the cloud providers themselves, right? In their never ending quest to squeeze more juice out of the lemon, more and more these kinds of add on services, if you will, they try to, they'll have an in-house, AWS is famous for this. We'll give you 80% of the functionality for 20% of the price. And don't be surprised to see AWS and or Microsoft and or Google and or Oracle provide an in-house service, at least if for what you're hosting on their infrastructure, because they have access that those other four don't, quite frankly. And so it might be a little bit easier for them using a back door. They're not going to be as full featured. They won't be as robust as these others you've mentioned, but they'll also be a fraction of the cost. And for those people who are really cost conscious, it might very well do the trick.